This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, where researchers come to learn, innovate, and connect.
We build a score. That's what we do. That's pretty easy to do. The trick is getting people to use that in institutions where they have not yet appealed to some of the people who have high scores. That's a problem.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Peter Wiley, a data mining expert in fundraising. Hello, Peter. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Hi, Jen. How are you? It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Peter, before we jump into how data has impacted fundraising, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share with us a little bit about how you fell into fundraising and what it's been like to partner with folks like John Sammis and Kevin McDonnell.
Well, my interest in data analysis goes way back to the late 60s when there were such things as punch cards, huge computers that couldn't do, a fraction of what the tiny little things that we have now can do. And that's what I thought I wanted to be, a data analyst. Unfortunately, I couldn't do the kind of thing that I do now back then, so I did something very different in the organizational development arena. And then I would say in the late 90s, I got introduced to something called list scoring by a guy named, actually I forget his name, but his first name was Bo. Anyway, it was the notion that lots of nonprofits had information in their databases about prospective donors and donors that was related to giving, and you could splice that stuff together into an algorithm or a score to predict who was going to give and who wasn't going to give. And that got me rocking and rolling. I left the organizational development business and kind of went off on my own as an independent consultant, training people how to do this in both nonprofits and in universities. And I got to speak at APRA. I just kind of slowly slid into the world of fundraising. All the organizations that I worked with, I thought had very worthy causes, and I just liked what they were doing. And the fact that I could practice my trade of statistics in that arena was a lot of fun. So that's how I got there.
How did you run into John Sammis?
I ran into him in October of 1993. I have this kind of savant memory for dates. He was at the time president of DataDesk, which is a company that still exists, and they developed something called DataDesk, which was an exploratory statistical package designed by a guy named Paul Bellman, who was then a professor at Cornell and had studied under a guy named John Tukey, who was the father of exploratory data analysis. And I got a hold of it and started playing around with it, and I just had a ball with it. And over the years, Sean and I began to talk. And then about 2006, we said, we talk about this so much, maybe we should work together. And that's when we started doing what we still do to this day.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's a great story. And I know you recently co-authored a book with Kevin McDonnell. How did that come about?
Kevin was one of our students, John's and my students, maybe 10 years ago. He's Canadian. He lives in Nova Scotia. He now works for Dalhousie University. At the time, he was working for another school. And we actually trained him and another person over the phone how to use DataDesk. And he became enamored not only of DataDesk, but of the whole notion that you could take data from an alumni database and build a predictive score with respect to alums that they were appealing to, perhaps not as efficiently as they would like. They were sending out a lot of mail to people who never responded. They were having trouble reaching people who they thought had the wherewithal to make a major gift, but it turns out that they were not in the least bit interested. And he was intrigued by the notion that you could take some of that data and really not only predict how much they would give, but their just general interest in giving, even if it wasn't a lot. And then he started writing a blog, I think in 2010, and I began contributing to that. That was just a wonderful relationship. What I did was not the typical blog. I would just take a bunch of data that I thought could answer an interesting question and then analyze it and write it up as if it were going to be submitted to, a peer-reviewed journal. But I wrote it in understandable English. Most of the articles that are written for peer-reviewed journals are indecipherable. They're horribly written. I tried to make them understandable so that they would not have been accepted by these journals, but at least the people that I intended to have read them could read them and understand them. So that's what I did with Kevin.
And that's how I met you, because I remember you posted on ProspectL, APRA's listserv at the time,
Yep.
and you were looking for people to review your article you had written. And
Yep.
I was working in Philadelphia, and I wasn't doing annual fund, but I was fascinated and offered a couple of times to review. And that's
Yep.
how we ended up striking up conversation.
Yep. And it's been a ball talking to you ever since.
It has been fun. And you've done a lot so far. I mean, you've written multiple books on data mining. You talk about using data effectively in fundraising. You've consulted with countless organizations. I'm really curious if you could share with us some of your thoughts, some of your observations about how data is being used effectively. And then also the flip side, when might it get in the way of fundraising?
Well, that's a good question, because I think data mining is a means to an end. The end always has to be, I think, an ask, or it's not necessarily an ask, but somebody volunteers money. They don't need to be asked, they just contribute. But that's the goal. Data mining and predictive modeling is in service of that goal, whether it's a 20-year-old sophomore, junior calling an alum from the call center, or somebody making a major ask to a very, very wealthy and well-intended donor, continuing donor at a university or a nonprofit. So that's what it's all about. And I think sometimes in the world of analytics, the tail begins to wag the dog. And I think to some extent that's going on now. We sort of forget as analysts that we're trying to tee people up for askers, whether the ask is, a letter, a call, or a personal visit. And sometimes, the tail is pretty complicated. Right now, there's something called R, which is all the rage among analysts. It's sort of a Wikipedia kind of thing where it's open source software. A lot of people like it. Anyway, there seems to be a lot of focus on using R for its own sake, as opposed to, wait a minute, why are we doing this in the first place? So in terms of what's going on right now, it's a little confusing, because there are lots of people who call themselves analysts out there in the world of advancement and development, whether it's universities or nonprofits, but it's not clear what they're really doing. They don't share that a whole lot with the rest of the world. You sort of have to take their word for the fact that they're doing it. When I ask probing questions of some of those people, it's clear that they maybe don't know as much about what they say they're doing as they think they do. So it's really hard to pin down what's going on out there. You gotta have a sense of it. You gotta pay attention to the listservs, go to conventions and that sort of thing. But it's not crystal clear what's going on out there.
That's interesting. One of the things that I think about, and I'm not an analyst by any stretch, but some of the key factors that help us provide development officers with good lists are missing for us. It's very difficult to find connections sometimes. They've been a donor in the past, they're lapsed, I'm not sure why or how they got on the list. Some of them aren't even donors. So connection can be very tough. And in nonprofits that have fewer data points, it gets even more difficult to look at things like engagement or affinity. How has that played out for you as you're building scores these days? How comfortable are you with what you're providing, or how do you clarify what you're providing?
What we do is get a whole bunch of data from an institution, whether it's a nonprofit or a university, and kind of splice it together into one big file, which includes a lot of fields and statistics. We call them variables, many of which are related to whether or not somebody has ever given at all. And we build a score. That's what we do. That's pretty easy to do. The trick is getting people to use that in institutions where they have not yet appealed to some of the people who have high scores. That's a problem. Our data says they're either very likely or pretty likely to give you a lot more money than they already have. Go after them. The low scores that you see down here, that's not the case. Don't go after them. Okay? So that's sort of one situation, one problem. Another is the nature of giving in all institutions that have donors. And it's very, very lopsided. There are very, very few people at the top of the pyramid, if you will, who've given hugely and consistently, often for decades. And then there's everybody else. The problem is, I think, from an intellectual standpoint, is how are those people different from people in their own age group and in their own kind of socioeconomic category? That is to say, they're wealthy too. Why are the ones that we see at the top of the pyramid who give a lot and consistently different from the ones who could do that but don't? That's a question that we haven't answered effectively, and it's not hidden in the data that John Sammis and I get. I think the only way you can do that, and I bang on this, I pound on the table all the time, is get out there and interview people who are doing that and get to know them better. I think there's funding out there. There are institutions that could do that kind of research. It's not being done, and it should be, because we just don't know enough about them. They're special. They deserve the best treatment in the world, but a lot of times we don't know that much about them, and sometimes we don't treat them very well. We just sort of take them for granted and sometimes treat them like they're ATM machines. That's not a good thing.
So it sounds like there's external information that could be better gathered and recorded as development officers are cultivating.
Well, it's the kind of thing that you can only do if you have an intimate conversation with somebody. We're all human beings as adults who've had lots of experiences in our lives, and we put out, a picture of ourselves to the world, but that's often very different from what we are at our core. And the only way to find out what's at our core is to talk to us caringly, supportively, and let us kind of tell you who we are. And most people are not good at that. Most major gift officers are not particularly good at that. Some are gifted at it. But that's not done by just looking at data in a file. You got to get out there and talk to these folks. And sometimes they're not going to disclose things until years later. But pretty soon you start to find out what really drives them in terms of why they've given so much money to your organization, your institution. But again, that's just plain old yakking away. It's better to be done face to face, but if you're good on the phone like you and I are, you can get it there too, but it needs to be done.
But it's so interesting because I've started to work with smaller nonprofits myself.
Yep.
And they need help prioritizing. They're starting a major gifts program. But because the younger group, the new development officers are raised in the age of data, sometimes the focus is on the data and they sort of fall apart when they have to reach out. And, I haven't realized how much prospect research can play a coaching role in that. Well, why are you hesitant to call this prospect? Let's look at what we see. What do you think is going to happen when you pick up the phone? This is new to me, but I am seeing that because they're raised in the age of data, they just sort of, it's almost like analysis paralysis. Like, I don't feel like I have enough information. I need to go find out more. Like, how did they get in our database? Well, I'm not sure you really care. You could spend hours doing that, but if you pick up the phone, you're going to find out really fast.
That's a good point. Two thoughts come to mind. One, making a call to somebody that you don't know, warming them up, and then asking them for money, is anxiety producing. That's always been a problem for people. But now we have a whole generation of people who are device oriented. You see so many families when you walk into a restaurant and everybody sits down and breaks out their device. They don't talk. And I think that affects the degree to which the people who are coming into the world of fundraising as askers get out there and do what they need to do. They don't know how to do it. Nobody's really taught them how to do it.
Well, it's definitely something that's teachable, though. And it's definitely something non-data related.
Right.
Which is kind of funny when we think about how we're able to now use data to promote fundraising to be more efficient. And yet we're still talking about people.
Yeah, and for some people, it's not teachable. Like take medicine. I think you're caring and nurturing, or you're not. And no amount of coaching, smiling, doing this, doing that, if you're not a people person, is going to work. And I think the same is in fundraising. So I think in fundraising, if we're talking major donors, we ought to be cultivating people who have a nurturing nature, who make people feel safe, and then give them some tips on what they can do even better, even though they're sort of born to do this sort of stuff. The people who aren't like that, I think should find another line of work. They don't belong in the field of major asking.
I've actually had veteran fundraisers, guys who have been doing major gift fundraising for decades, and they don't want me to give them too much information before they go on their visit, especially early in the game. They want to explore and just feel open with that prospect and kind of feel like having the information as baggage on that visit.
And really, all you got to do is just get them talking about, well, where are you from originally? Well, I'm from Montana. Okay. Wow. I didn't grow up in Montana. I grew up in New England. Were you a cowboy? It's just getting them talking. And I noticed that colleagues, I go to a club, it's a fitness place. And I noticed that the employees who work together, they don't know much about each other's backgrounds. But when I draw them out in front of another employee, they'll say, oh, I didn't know you did that. And I'm thinking, how could you not know that? Don't you talk to them? They don't ask questions like that. That is not normal social intercourse in America today. It just isn't. But if you're a major asker, you better learn how to answer those questions. And you better be interested in the answers, even if the person goes on and starts to bore you a little bit. It's really, really, really important. And I just think it doesn't get talked about enough in the world of fundraising.
It's kind of fun. The entire reason I'm able to pivot a bit and work with smaller organizations is because the technology has gotten so good. And as it's gotten better, it's gotten cheaper as well.
Yes.
So I'm able to help them tee up the names to make those first phone calls and then work with them monthly to talk through what they're doing, which is pretty cool. So on the one hand, data is pushing us forward, and on the other hand, it's sometimes making us forget about the people side, I guess.
Yeah. And I just, I love data and I love analyzing it. But you're right. It ultimately comes down to the relationship that you form with the person that you're asking. Again, whether or not you're a 19-year-old sophomore or a veteran major officer, gift officer, you're connecting with another human being who, for whatever reason, likes the mission of your organization. And your job is to find out, why do they like it? What drives them to give to you as opposed to something else, or give it all? And that requires a certain amount of patience. And it's not data. It's just, like you said, it's a human relationship, and it can be extremely rewarding, but not everybody's suited to do that. You certainly see that every day in your own work.
Well, before I let you go, I'm wondering if you have any top tips for career researchers on how they can become better prepared for the future of fundraising.
A fundamental question is, doing this really a passion for you? If it's not, maybe there's something else that's a passion for you that has nothing to do with advancement, with raising money, and you'd be better served going into that arena. However, if this is a passion for you, then just learn everything you possibly can within your own field, but in related fields. And just keep looking for opportunities. You may have to change organizations because there's so much bad management out there, but stick with it. Really become an expert so that your skills become sought out, invaluable, and make a career out of this, either as an employee, or if that doesn't work out, like it didn't work out for me, do it on your own as a consultant. But really dig into it and become a student of it. I would say you're a good example of that. You're a student of what you do, a voracious student. And you like to deal with people who are voracious students too. I think that's your passion, teaching people who want to learn new stuff.
And learning in the process of that.
Yeah. And writing about it too. Yeah.
There you go. It has been wonderful to talk with you. Thank you for sharing.
And it's been a ball.
That was Peter Wiley, a data mining expert in fundraising. To find Chat Bites and more prospect research educational resources, join us in the Institute's learning community at prospectresearchinstitute.org.